I showed in a previous seminar why a conscious state can't exist in multiple points in space-time. And that had really interesting implications. It means that conscious states can't be copied or repeated. You can't be teleported elsewhere. Computers can't be conscious. Artificial intelligence cannot be conscious. On the flip side, because computers can't be conscious, you can't upload your consciousness to a computer. Therefore, mind uploading is impossible. It means that we aren't living in a computer simulation, but it also means that consciousness is inherently non-local. So in today's seminar, I'm going to present a new, very clever proof as to why consciousness is not local, and then I'm going to end it with some really terrible logical blunders made by physicists on this particular example. So in the previous seminar, I showed that more than one instance of a particular conscious state cannot exist at multiple points in space-time. As a result of that, conscious states are non-local. Now, quantum mechanics is inherently non-local, so do I think that there's some relationship between quantum entanglement and consciousness? I think there probably is. But that isn't what I showed. I just simply showed that conscious states are non-local. So if they're non-local, then where exactly is my conscious state right now? It certainly feels like it's right here, right? And this probably is the motivation for most scientists believing with certainty that consciousness is produced entirely by the brain, which I showed you in that previous seminar is a false statement as a logical contradiction. But it certainly feels like my conscious state is produced in my brain, or certainly somewhere here. And the reason for that is a lot of things affect my conscious state, specifically things that I can see, right? So these particular eyes, which are located at a particular place in space-time, produce information that I consciously perceive. Same with my ears, right? So behind my eyes is a brain. Between my ears, which receive auditory information and affect my consciousness, is also my brain. But other things like my taste and my sense of smell are all in this region. And I also can feel things. My tactile sensations can also be up here, but I also have tactile sensations elsewhere. But the point is, it certainly seems like my conscious awareness is produced by this, or at the very maximum, this body, right? So that's why it seems like consciousness happens to be localized at a particular point in space and time. It's because our senses directly affect our conscious state. But if indeed consciousness is non-local, which I've already shown, then where exactly does my consciousness exist? Where does it reside? On that note, we're going to talk about Dr. Stoica's paper. First of all, computationalism is this notion that consciousness can be reduced to computing, and specifically digital computing. If we invoke quantum mechanics here, then we are already talking about non-locality. So the idea of computationalism is that conscious states can be reduced to digital computing. So that means a computer that manipulates bits, which are ones and zeros or ons and offs or whatever, so as to produce conscious states. So here's what he does. He starts with the assumption of computationalism. Computationalism inherently assumes that consciousness is algorithmic. So an algorithm is just a series of steps that are performed. So you take a certain input, you perform steps on them, and you produce an output. And that's what software does. That's what the apps on your phone do. That's what it means to say that consciousness is algorithmic, that it is something that can be reduced to a computer or what a computer does. So he starts with this assumption. Then he gives this really interesting thought experiment. He says, well, if we assume computationalism, then that means that a conscious state is produced by a computer running software. But a computer can be broken up into various parts. So imagine, for example, if we had stars. Here's one star, here's another, and here's another. And they're separated by some large distance. I mean, they always are, but let's say this is separated by 1 million light years from here to here, from here to here, and these are separated by something less than that, but still something large, 500,000 light years, something like that. And what he says is, let's take that computer, which again, we've assumed produces a conscious state, and let's break it up into, say, 3 pieces and put a chunk here, a chunk here, a chunk here. Now, he extends this argument even further and says, well, we can even break up the computer into smaller components. Ultimately, we can break it up into 2-bit pieces. And his argument for that is that any logical gate can ultimately be represented as a series of 2-bit gates, and that's true. So you could actually imagine breaking up this computer into thousands or millions of different 2-bit pieces that are all located at or near or orbiting stars. Here's something that's sort of interesting. Let's just say that on this particular star happens to be a portion of the computer that contains a string of bits, and there are 2 particular bits on this star that currently read 0 and 1. And it turns out that this particular bit corresponds to happiness or sadness of the person's conscious state. Now, realistically, of course, it's never going to be that simple. It seems unlikely it would be the single flipping of a single bit that would cause such a drastic change in conscious state. So you can always extend the argument, but the point is, just for simplicity, we'll just say, let's say this is the happiness, sadness bit. And over here on this star happens to be a series of bits, and one of those corresponds to the thirst feeling or the thirst experience. So let's say right now this would correspond to being not thirsty, and this would correspond to being sad. Let's say that these happen to change so that now this bit becomes 0, 1, so this corresponds to an experience of thirst, and this one changes right here, and this one corresponds to a feeling of happiness. So here's my question. What does the person experience as a conscious state? So what is the mental state or the conscious state that is experienced by this person? Is it sad thirsty, happy thirsty, sad not thirsty, or happy not thirsty? What is the experience of this person? And so what Dr. Stoica recognizes is that if there is going to be a single integrated experience, he uses this phrase, integrated experience, then this is really problematic because that experience depends on information that is space-like separated. Space-like separated simply means that without counting instantaneous quantum effects, there is no fact of the matter about which one of these happens to be true at a particular time, because simultaneity in special relativity is relative. It depends on the velocity of the observer. So because these locations are space-like separated, it's not possible to have an integrated experience through a computer producing consciousness where that computer is broken up into parts that are space-like separated. It's a really clever argument. Like I said, I'm going to post this paper for you to see. And I'm going to give my interpretation of this argument. It's not exactly what the person had in mind, but I think it's pretty close, and it kind of gives you the flavor of why computationalism is problematic. And here it is. There is, at this moment, a particular conscious state that I'm experiencing. Now, I can't prove that to you, but there is. You could certainly prove it to yourself that there's a certain experience that you are consciously experiencing right now. But there's something that I'm experiencing right now. And let's say that that experience happens to be, well, I'm very happy, I'm enjoying doing this, but I'm thirsty, which is the reason I have a glass of lemonade. So I'm happy and thirsty at this moment, at the same time. In other words, this particular conscious experience is one of being happy and thirsty simultaneously. And that is what Dr. Stoica would refer to as an integrated conscious or mental experience. So it is in fact true that I'm experiencing, so let's do this assumption 2. I am experiencing something. I'm not going to put what that is. It could be, it might be, in this case, I am happy and thirsty. But the point is there's some particular experience, conscious experience that I'm experiencing right now where I feel both happy and thirsty at the same time. So if these two things are true, and also, of course, the third assumption is information cannot travel faster than the speed of light, and I'll just write that as c for the speed of light. So if you take these three assumptions, then let's ask, where is my conscious experience actually located? Where in space-time is it located? Okay, so what I've drawn here are, these three stars that contain everything necessary to produce my conscious state. So because of these three assumptions, there must be some place that my conscious state is actually located. Let's say that it's located at this particular point right here. And what I mean by that is that this is the spatiotemporal location of my conscious awareness, and whether or not I feel happy or sad or thirsty or not thirsty depends on the information that travels from here and here. So that would be fine, because you can see that once this flips from not thirsty to thirsty or sad to happy, when I experience it is in fact determined, assuming that information is sent from these stars at the speed of light, then that state is determined by when those bit flip information pieces are received at this point. So that at least would give an answer as to what my conscious state is at any given time, and it would explain why I have a particular conscious experience, why it feels integrated in the sense of feeling both happy and thirsty, or whatever it happens to be. Well, here's the problem with that. If it were the case that my conscious experience is right here, and it depends on the information that comes from out here, then really this is just the brain. We haven't broken this up into enough parts to actually do the experiment. In other words, if my consciousness depends on or arises entirely from what's inside this local volume, well, then we haven't done the thought experiment properly. Let's simply break that up into other pieces. So then you break that up and do the experiment again, until eventually you get to the point where there is no particular physical object that corresponds to the location of that conscious awareness. So already that's kind of weird, and that kind of is a contradiction by itself if we think that computationalism is true, if we think that consciousness arises from a particular ordering of bits or a particular algorithm that is acting on those bits or on input data. Then already we have a problem, because if we do the thought experiment right, then it turns out that there is no physical matter that corresponds to the spatiotemporal location of a particular conscious state. I mean, that seems problematic by itself. But even if you say, whatever, I don't really care, what we'll do is, okay, fine, maybe the consciousness does not arise right here. Maybe it arises somewhere kind of in between all of these. So maybe the person, as it were, is located right there in space-time, even though there happens to be nothing physical there, but that's where the person's awareness happens to be located. And you can see it's kind of between these three parts of the computer, or these thousands of parts of computers that are distributed among thousands of different stars. So maybe that's the solution. But here's the problem with that. So remember, it has to be that the person's conscious awareness, if there's a location to it, then it has to be determined by the locations of these other parts of the computer. Because whatever this, let's say this person happens to be feeling, I forgot what this was. This was sadness and happiness, right? It changed from sadness to happiness. So right now, let's say that the person is sad because that bit flip hasn't yet reached this person. So this person cannot be located here. I'll call this the person prime, cannot be located here because this person has received that bit flip. So this person is happy. So it can't be that the person is sad and happy at the same time. That's the whole point of me having a particular integrated experience at this moment. So these two can't be the same. And you can imagine for all kinds of different experiences and conscious perceptions, ultimately the locations of the various pieces of the computer that produces the person's conscious state have to determine where that conscious awareness exists in the universe, even though we already proved that it can't be a thing that represents that location for that awareness. So it's just sort of out in the middle of space somewhere. But then here's the problem with these three things determining that location. The first is computationalism by itself. Remember, that was the assumption. When you do something on your phone and it's running software in the form of an app, does the function of that app depend on where you're located? Well, if it depends on GPS, of course it does. But in general, no, right? The software is going to run the same no matter where you happen to be. Your computer, you're running a word processing program, that software will run the same. The function will be the same no matter where it happens to be. And no matter how, by the way, that computer happens to be configured. You could run the exact same software on different computers with different specifications and different locations. That software will run exactly the same on those computers. So by assuming computationalism by itself, we've already ruled out the idea that the locations of these things could have anything to do with the state of consciousness, the algorithm that produces this consciousness. So already that's a problem if the locations of these things affect the result, because we know that that is simply not true in computers. Well, then you say, okay, well, maybe it's a little bit different. Maybe it's not exactly computationalism. Yeah, fine, whatever. You know, we're going to put these different bits or pieces of computer in different places, and for whatever reason, they actually do determine a location, and it does depend on their location. Here's another problem with that. These pieces don't know where they are in relation to each other because they could be moving or accelerating in all kinds of different ways that wouldn't be known. So for example, let's say that this one happens to be moving out because it has inertia, it's already moving out, and then it gets near another star and that changes its trajectory, right? So it causes the star to or maybe I should show on the board, maybe it circles around something like this. The problem is this star couldn't know about it, not that it's conscious, although that's ironic because the whole thought experiment is about consciousness being distributed over different stars. But nevertheless, the star couldn't know about the location of this thing in a time quicker than light can travel from this, which means that the location of the awareness can't be determined because this thing doesn't even know where these things are. So in other words, they don't know where they are relative to each other, and therefore there cannot be a particular location where that conscious awareness exists. Done. We've proven that at least one of these three assumptions is false. Now, I'm pretty comfortable with information traveling no faster than the speed of light. I'm real comfortable with the fact that I am in fact experiencing something at this moment that is integrated. And by that I mean I'm either feeling happy or sad and thirsty or not thirsty at the same time. Right now, I'm happy and I'm thirsty, and that's a different conscious experience than feeling happy and not thirsty or sad and thirsty. So because I'm feeling that, I know that I can feel a particular experience. So that must mean that computationalism is false. So if computationalism is false, a lot of interesting things result from that. Because this assumes that conscious states can be reduced to computing on a general purpose computer, well, that's false. That means that consciousness is not just computing. Well, that means that artificial intelligence will never be conscious, can't be conscious, because they can't have an integrated experience without violating relativity. It means that mind uploading is impossible because we can't upload our conscious states to a computer because computationalism is false. But it also means, and this was the conclusion of the professor who wrote this, it means that these kinds of experiences that we have, if we accept that there is such a thing as an integrated conscious experience or an integrated mental state, which is to say, experiencing happy and thirsty as one experience, if we accept that that's true, then that mental state must be inherently non-local. Non-local means that whatever produces this person's conscious state does not and cannot reside entirely in that local volume, which is exactly what I showed you in that previous seminar. But this is a different, related, but different way to prove it, and I think it's very clever. So this person's conscious state, my conscious state, is non-local in the sense that there's no local volume that contains and entirely produces my conscious state. Now, the professor also points out what I pointed out previously about the fact that, okay, maybe the brain isn't a digital computer, but that's irrelevant because any local volume, the information inside any local volume, ultimately can be approximated to any desired precision with digital information. And then because of the Bekenstein bound, which is the limit of quantum information in a local volume, ultimately, even though it's a vast number, ultimately the information in a given volume can necessarily be represented by a string of ones and zeros. And so from that, all of this follows. So he ultimately concludes that mental states that are integrated experiences are non-local in the sense that they depend instantaneously on space-like separated events. They must. I want to end this seminar on a really strong example of how physicists are bad at logic. So only a few people have actually shown, I'm one of them, this person's another, have actually shown that conscious states are inherently non-local. But then there are a lot of people who believe they are. For example, Nobel laureate Roger Penrose believes that conscious states are non-local because they are inherently quantum mechanical, and quantum mechanics involves quantum entanglement, which is non-local. But in the process of trying to prove to the world that conscious states are non-local, of course, what we as academics do is to write and submit papers to journals and hoping that we will get them published. So this is a typical rejection. So I asked Dr. Stoica in a private email what troubles he had in getting his paper published. And he said that several people told me that the computational theory is a counterexample because a computer is local and yet it can support consciousness. That is, it is exactly what I disprove in the paper. So let that sink in. He writes a paper, does a thought experiment, does several proofs showing that conscious states cannot be local. And the response from reviewers or referees of his paper is, no, you're wrong because computers can be conscious. So if you're not yet getting why that's ridiculous, here's why. What he showed is, let's assume that this means integrated experiences, that conscious states are integrated experiences. And we assume the truth of special relativity, that information cannot travel faster than the speed of light. What he shows is that this implies that conscious states are non-local, and this implies necessarily that computationalism must be false. So that symbol means not. So what he's shown with this thought experiment is that if we have integrated experience and special relativity is true, that implies that computationalism is false. The counter argument from these physicist referees for these journals was not to attack this or this, but rather to say, oh, no, you're wrong. Computers can create consciousness. Therefore, this is wrong. That was their response. It's a massively silly answer because it doesn't recognize the logic in this argument. And unless you can show a situation in which a computer actually is conscious, or you've uploaded your mind to a computer or whatever, then there actually is zero empirical data for computationalism. There is zero empirical data to reject this, and therefore no reason to reject that. So he ended up having to modify his paper to be more politically correct and kinder toward computationalists, even though the whole point of his argument is that it's false. Drives me friggin' crazy. So that's it.